I was reaching for my glass of water when my son slid his phone across the table and whispered without moving his lips, "Mom, look down." It was a Sunday evening in Carmel, Indiana, and nothing about the dinner had seemed unusual until that moment. I looked under the table. Daniel's phone was resting beside my purse. On the screen was a message he had typed with his thumbs. "Mom, don't drink that glass of water. Pretend you're having chest pain and leave immediately." I read it twice. Then I looked at my son. He was sitting across from me with his shoulders stiff and his eyes fixed on his plate. He looked terrified. Not worried. Terrified. I slowly lifted my eyes toward the glass beside my right hand. It was just water. Nothing strange about it. Clear cold with 2 little cubes of ice floating near the top. Karen had poured it for me about 10 minutes earlier. Linda Karen said from across the table. "Are you okay?" I looked at her. She was smiling. That smile is something I would remember for a long time. "I'm fine," I said. Daniel finally looked up. His eyes met mine for half a second. Then he looked away. I understood. Whatever was happening, I couldn't ask questions at that table, so I did something that felt completely ridiculous. I put my hand against my chest. "Karen, stop chewing," Mom, Daniel said. I think something's wrong." My voice sounded weak, and I hated how convincing it was. Karen immediately pushed her chair back. "What kind of wrong? I don't know." I took a shallow breath. My chest hurts. Daniel stood so quickly that his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. "I'm taking her to the ER." Karen stared at him. "Daniel, seriously?" She said her chest hurts. She's probably having indigestion. I looked at Karen. For just a second, her eyes moved toward the glass. Then back to me. That tiny movement was enough. I stood up. My knees felt weak, although I knew it wasn't from chest pain. Daniel was already beside me. "I've got you, Mom." Karen followed us into the foyer. "Wait. You're really going to the hospital?" Daniel grabbed his keys from the little wooden bowl beside the front door. "Yes." "Daniel, she just ate a huge dinner." "I know. She had dessert. I know Karen. She always gets indigestion when she eats too much." Daniel stopped. He turned around. I said, "I'm taking her." There was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Karen noticed it too. She folded her arms. "Fine." The word came out cold. Daniel opened the door. I stepped outside into the damp December air. Their house was in a quiet neighborhood off Main Street, the kind of place where lawns were neatly trimmed even in winter, and every driveway seemed to have 2 SUVs parked in it. A few Christmas lights were still hanging from the porch roofs even though the holiday had passed. Once we were inside Daniel's Toyota Camry, he pulled away from the curb. Neither of us spoke for nearly a minute. I watched the houses pass through the passenger window. Finally, I said, "What was in the glass?" Daniel tightened his hands around the steering wheel. "I don't know. You told me not to drink it. I saw Karen put something in it." I turned toward him. "When right before dinner? Why didn't you stop her?" He swallowed. "Because I wasn't sure what I saw." The car was quiet again. Then he said, "Mom, I've been watching her for a while." That sentence hurt more than I expected. Not because of Karen, because of the fear in my son's voice. "What do you mean watching her? I noticed things." "What things?" he sighed. "She's been asking about your money." I almost laughed. "Karen has always asked about my retirement. Not like this." I stared at him. "What does that mean?" "She asked me how much your house is worth." I looked out the window again. My house was a 3-bedroom ranch on the north side of Indianapolis. I'd bought it years ago, back when prices were nothing like they were now. I had worked in medical billing for nearly 3 decades, saved carefully, paid the mortgage down, and lived within my means. It wasn't a mansion, but it was mine. And she asked if you had life insurance. I felt something settle heavily in my stomach. What else? She asked whether Grandma Martha had any savings. That one got my attention. My mother, Daniel, nodded. She asked how much assisted living costs. I looked at him. "Why, I don't know." "Daniel." He shook his head. "I don't know, Mom." We pulled into the emergency room at IU Health North. The waiting room was busy even for a Sunday night. A television mounted near the ceiling was showing a Colts highlight reel with the sound turned down. An elderly man was asleep in a wheelchair. A young mother was trying to keep a little boy from climbing onto the vending machine. Everything looked painfully ordinary. A nurse took me back. After an EKG blood pressure check and several questions, I finally admitted the truth. My chest doesn't really hurt. The nurse raised an eyebrow. I thought you were having chest pain. I was pretending. She looked at Daniel, then back at me. Okay, that's a new one. Daniel rubbed his forehead. I told her to say it. The nurse gave us a look that said she had seen stranger things. The tests didn't show anything immediately dangerous. After nearly an hour, we were sitting in a small examination room waiting for the doctor. I stared at my hands. I kept thinking about that glass, the water, Karen's smile, and the way her eyes had moved toward the drink when I said I felt sick. Daniel sat beside me. I'm sorry, he said. For what? For putting you in this. You didn't put me in anything. He looked down. I should have told you sooner. I didn't answer, because part of me was angry with him, and part of me understood. When you love someone, you can spend a long time explaining away things you would immediately recognize if they were happening to a stranger. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket. I need to show you something. He pulled out his phone. There were photographs. The first showed Karen standing near my purse during a visit to my house. The second showed her holding my medication organizer. The third showed a stack of papers on my kitchen counter. I recognized them immediately. They're the papers Karen asked me to sign last week. Daniel nodded. I took pictures because I didn't know what else to do. I stared at the screen. Then I looked at my son. What aren't you telling me? Daniel took a slow breath. His voice dropped. Mom, that wasn't the first time I saw her put something in your drink. I felt the room go very still. And for the first time that night, I stopped wondering whether I was imagining things. I started wondering how long my son had been afraid for me. Daniel's words stayed with me long after the doctor finally came in. That wasn't the first time I saw her put something in your drink. I kept looking at him. What do you mean, Daniel? He glanced toward the closed examination room door. I've seen her do it before. How many times he hesitated? Twice. I felt a chill move through me. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wasn't sure what she was doing. That doesn't answer my question. He looked down at his hands. I was afraid you'd think I was trying to break up my own marriage. That answer hurt because it sounded so much like him. Daniel had always been the kind of man who tried to keep everybody happy. When he was a kid, he would apologize when somebody else bumped into him. At 34, not much had changed. He hated confrontation. He hated disappointing people. And apparently he had been carrying this around alone. The doctor returned a few minutes later and told me my heart tests looked fine. He said that if I had genuine chest pain, I had done the right thing by coming in, but there was no indication that I was having a cardiac event that evening. Daniel thanked him. I signed the discharge papers. Neither of us mentioned the water. Once we were back in the parking lot, I said, "Take me home." Daniel looked surprised. Your house? Yes, Mom Karen. I don't want to go back to her house tonight. He nodded. We drove to my place on the north side of Indianapolis. I made coffee when we got home, mostly because I didn't know what else to do. It was nearly 10 o'clock. I sat at my kitchen table in my slippers, staring at a mug I had forgotten to drink. Daniel sat across from me. Start from the beginning, I said. He rubbed his face. About a month ago, Karen started asking questions. What kind? Your retirement? Your house? Grandma? I nodded. I remember her asking about my house. She asked me if you'd ever considered downsizing. That doesn't sound criminal, I know. He leaned back. At first I thought she was just talking. So what changed? She started asking me how much money you had. I stared at him. What did you tell her? Nothing. Good. He gave me a tired smile. I'm not completely useless. I almost smiled back. Then he continued. After that, I noticed her going through your mail when she visited. I frowned. She did that once. Why didn't you tell me? Because she said she was looking for something from the insurance company. Did she find it? I don't know. I stood up and walked into the living room. My mail usually sat in a basket beside the front door. I opened the drawer where I kept old statements. Everything looked normal. Then I remembered something. Last week I said Karen asked me to sign some papers. Daniel stood. What papers? She said they were related to helping with Grandma's future medical expenses. His face changed. Where are they? I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? I thought Karen took them. Daniel went quiet. Then he said, Mom, that's the paperwork I photographed. I turned around. Why? Because I didn't think it was what she said it was. The next morning I called my bank. The woman who answered was named Michelle. She had helped me several times over the years, and I recognized her voice immediately. After verifying my identity, she became unusually serious. Mrs. Mercer, we're glad you called. Why, there was an attempted transfer from your account yesterday afternoon. I sat down. How much? There was a pause. $180,000. For several seconds I couldn't speak. Daniel was standing beside the kitchen counter. He watched my face. Where was it going? Michelle gave me the name of the receiving account. I wrote it down. Then I stopped. Daniel. He came closer. I handed him the paper. His face went pale. The account was connected to Frank Whitmore, Karen's older brother. I knew Frank. Everybody knew Frank. He had been selling financial products around Hamilton County for years. He always wore a nice watch and talked about investments like he was doing you a personal favor. He had also borrowed money from Daniel twice. At least that's what Daniel had told me. How much does Frank owe you? I asked. Daniel looked embarrassed. About $12,000. I stared at him. $12,000. It wasn't all at once. Daniel. I know. He sat down. He said he needed help getting through a business problem. I let out a long breath. For the first time, the pieces started lining up. Karen's questions, the paperwork, Frank's debt, the attempted transfer, and the glass. I wanted to call Karen immediately. I wanted to hear her explain all of it. But Daniel stopped me. Don't. Why? Because if she's doing this, we need to know exactly what she's doing. I hated that he was right. So I called my attorney instead. Her name was Susan Miller, and she had handled a small property matter for me years earlier. I explained what had happened. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, Linda, don't confront anyone yet. I wasn't planning to. She paused. You were. I almost laughed. Maybe. Susan told me to change my passwords, freeze certain accounts, and gather every document I could find. Then she said something that stuck with me. Don't try to win an argument. Build a record. So that's what I did. For the next several days, Daniel and I went through everything. Bank statements, emails, texts, old paperwork, even the notes I had scribbled on envelopes. It was exhausting, and it made me angry in a way I wasn't used to feeling. I had spent my entire adult life being careful with money. I had clipped coupons. I had repaired things instead of replacing them. I had driven the same Buick for 11 years. And now someone was apparently trying to take what I had spent decades building. One evening, Daniel came over with a folder. He looked like he hadn't slept. I found something. He placed a printed email on my table. It was between Karen and Frank. I read the first few lines. Then I stopped. They weren't talking about helping Grandma. They were talking about me. And they were discussing my house as if it already belonged to them. I looked at Daniel. He swallowed. I think they planned to make you sell it. My hand tightened around the paper. Why? He shook his head. I don't know. But there was something else in his face, something he hadn't told me yet. What he looked toward the window. Then he said quietly, Karen wanted me to convince you to change your will. I stared at my son. How long ago? 3 weeks. And what did you say? Daniel looked at me. I told her no, That was the first time I understood that whatever was happening inside my family wasn't going to disappear by itself. And I still didn't know the worst part. 3 days after Daniel showed me the email, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, 3 bank statements, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I had always believed that if you worked hard, paid your bills, kept your nose clean, and treated people decently, life would generally leave you alone. Apparently, that was wishful thinking. My attorney, Susan Miller, had told me not to confront Karen. "Linda," she said over the phone, "if there's wrongdoing here, you don't want to tip anyone off before you know what you're dealing with. I understand, and don't delete anything." "I won't. Don't edit texts. Don't forward things and then erase the originals. Keep everything exactly as it is." I wrote that down. Then she added, "And don't go digging around on somebody else's computer." I looked across the kitchen at Daniel. He looked embarrassed. "That part might be for both of us," I said. He gave me a tired smile. "Probably." The next morning I called my bank again. Michelle walked me through the attempted $180,000 transfer. It hadn't gone through. The bank had flagged it because of the amount and because the transaction didn't fit my normal account activity. I was grateful for that. But there was something else. Someone had attempted to use a financial authorization connected to paperwork I had signed. I asked Michelle to send me copies of everything. She couldn't send certain documents directly to me by email, but she arranged for me to pick them up at the branch. So Daniel and I went there together. The branch was one of those ordinary places with gray carpet, fluorescent lights, and a little bowl of peppermints near the counter. A woman named Rachel brought us into a small office. She slid the paperwork across the desk. "This is what was presented to us," she said. I recognized my signature. My stomach tightened. I had signed it. But I hadn't understood what it meant. I had thought I was authorizing Karen to help coordinate some financial matters related to my mother's future care. Instead, the document gave another person broad authority to act on my behalf regarding certain financial transactions. I leaned back in the chair. "How did I not see this?" Rachel didn't answer. There wasn't a good answer. I had trusted the person who handed it to me. That was the answer. Daniel looked at the document. "Mom, this is what Karen said was for Grandma." "I know." He shook his head. "I should have stopped you. You didn't know. I knew something wasn't right." I looked at him. Knowing something feels wrong isn't the same as knowing what to do about it. He didn't respond. We left the bank with copies of the records and went straight to Susan's office. She reviewed everything carefully. The attempted transfer concerned her. The authorization concerned her more. But she wouldn't tell me what I wanted to hear. I wanted her to say they're guilty. Instead, she said, "We have serious red flags. We need more." I remember being frustrated. More? Yes. How much more? As much as we can legally document. That afternoon, Daniel and I went through his old messages. There were dozens. Most were ordinary. Grocery lists, work schedules, arguments about whose turn it was to pick up dry cleaning. Then we found a conversation between Karen and Frank. The messages weren't explicit enough to prove everything, but they were troubling. Frank had written, "Once the house sells, we can clean this up." Karen replied, "She needs to agree voluntarily." Frank wrote, "She'll agree if Daniel gets her to understand she can't manage everything alone." I stared at the screen. Daniel sat beside me. Neither of us spoke. Then another message appeared. Karen had written, "She doesn't need to know everything at once." My hands went cold. I looked at Daniel. "This is about my house." He nodded. His jaw tightened. There was another message from Frank. "What's the number?" Karen replied. "About 420. I knew exactly what that meant. $420,000. Approximately what my house was worth. I pushed the phone away. For a moment I wanted to cry. Not because of the money, because they had reduced my home to a number. The house where Daniel had taken his first steps. The kitchen where I had made birthday cakes. The little back bedroom where my mother had slept during Christmas visits. To them, it was simply 420. Daniel reached over. "Mom." I stood up. "I need some air." I walked outside. The January wind cut through my sweater. I stood on the porch and watched a neighbor scrape ice from his windshield. Everything around me looked normal. That's what bothered me. The world didn't change just because your family betrayed you. The mail still arrived, people still walked their dogs, the trash truck still came on Thursday mornings, and you still had to remember to take the chicken out of the freezer. That evening, Daniel told me he was moving out of his house. Just for a while, he said, "Where are you going? I'll stay with a friend." I knew he was hurting. "You don't have to leave because of me. I'm not leaving because of you." He looked down. "I'm leaving because I don't trust her." That sentence broke something in me. I hugged him. He held on longer than he had since he was a teenager. A week passed. Then Karen called me. Her voice sounded calm, almost gentle. "Linda, I know Daniel has been filling your head with stories." I said nothing. "I think we need to talk." "About what?" "About everything." "Where there's a Panera near Rangeline Road." I looked at the clock. Tomorrow at 2. I agreed. Then I called Susan. She told me not to go alone, so Tom Alvarez agreed to drive me. Tom had been my neighbor for almost 15 years. He was a retired Indianapolis firefighter, and he had the practical attitude of a man who had spent his life dealing with problems, while everyone else was still deciding whether there was a problem. Before we left, he said, "Remember what Susan told you." "What?" "Don't argue. Listen." We sat in the Panera near Rangeline Road the next afternoon. Karen arrived 5 minutes late. She looked tired. For a moment I almost felt sorry for her. She sat down across from me. "Linda," she said softly, "I never wanted any of this to happen." I didn't answer. She wiped her eyes. "Frank has been struggling." There it was. I waited. "He owes money." "How much?" She shook her head. "I don't even know anymore." I looked at her. "Then why was someone trying to transfer $180,000 from my account?" Her face changed, only slightly. "But I saw it. I didn't do that. Who did I think, Frank? And the paperwork I was trying to help whom?" She looked at me. Then she said something that made my entire body go still. "You were supposed to drink it before Daniel got suspicious." I didn't move. Karen's face drained of color. She had realized what she'd just said. I stood up. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten her. I simply picked up my purse. And for the first time since that Sunday dinner, I knew exactly what we had. Not suspicion. Not a feeling. A statement. A mistake she couldn't take back. I didn't say another word to Karen at Panera. I picked up my purse, pushed my chair back, and walked toward the door. My legs felt strangely steady. Inside, though, my thoughts were moving so fast I could barely keep up. "You were supposed to drink it before Daniel got suspicious." I kept hearing the sentence, over and over. By the time Tom and I reached his truck, I had already pulled out my phone. I need to write this down. Tom unlocked the doors. "Write what exactly?" "What she said." I sat in the passenger seat and typed every word I could remember. The time, the location, where Karen had been sitting, what she had said before it, what happened afterward. Tom didn't interrupt. When I finished, I read it twice. Then I sent the notes to Susan. She called me less than 10 minutes later. "Linda, don't contact Karen again. I wasn't planning to." "Good." She admitted. "I know what you heard." Susan's voice was calm. "Now we need to preserve everything around it." I leaned my head against the seat. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief. Not because the situation was over, it wasn't, but because I wasn't imagining things anymore. There was a trail, and trails can be followed. Over the next several days, Susan helped me work through the practical steps. My accounts were secured. The questionable authorization was revoked. The bank placed additional safeguards on larger transactions. I changed passwords. I changed my email recovery information. I even changed the code on the little lockbox where I kept my property papers. It felt strange doing all of that in my own home. I had never thought of myself as a suspicious person. Now I checked envelopes before opening them. I looked at every bank notification. I kept records of phone calls. I started saving copies of things I once would have thrown away. Daniel helped. He also looked miserable. One night, he sat at my kitchen table while I sorted papers into folders. I keep thinking about the first time I noticed something. I looked up. When was that Thanksgiving? I stopped. What happened? Karen asked if you were planning to leave the house to me. I sighed. I remember. She asked me in the garage, and I told her I didn't know. Daniel stared at this table. She said, "Well, somebody has to think about the future." I placed the folder down. "Daniel, you couldn't have known." "I should have." "No." I said it firmly. "You should have trusted your instincts sooner. That's different." He looked at me. "I thought I could fix it." I smiled sadly. "That's what children do. I'm 34. You're still my child." He laughed quietly. It was the first normal laugh we'd shared in weeks. Then his expression changed. "Mom, I need to tell you something else. What I found, more messages." He pulled out his phone. Karen and Frank had been discussing my house for months. There were references to repairs, property taxes, estimated sale prices. One message from Frank said, "If she sells, I can get current again." Another from Karen said Daniel has to be on board. Then came the message that made Daniel put his phone face down. Karen had written, "If he won't help, we'll work around him." I stared at those words. They weren't just trying to use me, they were prepared to use my son too. Susan reviewed the messages. She told us they would be useful, especially when combined with the bank records and the documents. But she also warned us not to assume that every suspicious message was enough by itself. That was the frustrating part. Real life isn't television. People don't confess everything in one neat paragraph. You build a case one piece at a time, and sometimes you have to wait. The waiting was difficult. Karen began telling people that I was confused. She called my cousin and said I had become overly emotional about money. She told another family member that Daniel was having a mental breakdown because of stress. Then she started leaving polite voicemails for me. "Linda, I love you. I hope you're doing okay. Please don't let this destroy our family. I saved everyone." I didn't respond. One Saturday morning I went grocery shopping at Meijer. I remember standing in the produce section holding a bag of apples when my phone buzzed. It was Daniel. He had found another file on an old tablet. It contained a spreadsheet. At the top was my name. Under it were numbers: house value, savings, retirement, life insurance. And next to my house was a handwritten note: "Sell within 90 days." I stared at the screen. The apples suddenly felt heavy. I put them back. I went home. By then, Susan had arranged for us to meet with the appropriate authorities and provide the financial records. There was no dramatic raid, no shouting, just paperwork questions, copies, signatures, and long conversations in offices that smelled faintly of printer paper. That was how the truth began to catch up with them. The final confrontation came at my mother's assisted living community. Karen had arranged a family gathering there on a Sunday afternoon. She apparently intended to present herself as the concerned daughter-in-law who was trying to help an aging woman who could no longer manage her affairs. I almost didn't go. Susan told me I didn't have to, but I wanted to, not for revenge, for my mother. Martha was 81. She deserved to know who had been making decisions around her. When I arrived, Karen was already there. She smiled. "Linda." I walked past her. Daniel came in behind me. Susan was with us. So was Tom. Karen's smile disappeared. "What are they doing here?" I sat down. "I think it's time we talked." Karen folded her arms. "About what I placed a folder on the table. Your paperwork." She glanced at it. Then at Daniel. "You've been talking to my husband." Daniel didn't answer. I opened the folder. The $180,000 transfer. Karen's face tightened. "I told you I didn't authorize that. Then explain why your brother's account was listed as the recipient." Frank, who had been standing near the window, stepped forward. "This is ridiculous." I looked at him. "Then explain it." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I placed another document on the table. "Then explain why you had a spreadsheet listing my savings, retirement account, life insurance, and house value." Karen's face changed. She looked at Frank. Frank looked at her, and suddenly the room was quiet. Daniel reached into his folder. "I have the messages too." Karen's voice rose. "You went through my private messages," Daniel answered quietly. "You were planning to take my mother's house." Karen turned toward me. "Linda, please." I looked at her. For months she had controlled the conversation. She had explained. She had redirected. She had made me question myself. Not anymore. I pushed one final paper across the table. It was the bank record. Then I said, "You can explain everything now." Karen stared at the page. Frank stepped backward. And for the first time, neither of them had anything left to say. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. My mother was sitting near the window watching the trees outside sway in the afternoon wind. She didn't understand every detail, and honestly, I was grateful for that. She didn't need to hear every ugly thing that had happened. She only needed to know that I was handling it. Karen finally looked at me. "Linda, I can explain." I nodded. "Then explain." She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Frank stepped forward instead. "This is being blown completely out of proportion." I looked at him. "Then why was my money being transferred to your account?" "It was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding of $180,000. He didn't answer. Daniel stood beside me. His hands were in his pockets. He looked exhausted. Karen turned toward him. "You're really doing this?" Daniel's voice was quiet. "You did this." She shook her head. "No, I was trying to help." I almost laughed. There was something almost unbelievable about hearing that sentence after everything we'd uncovered. But I didn't laugh. I had spent too many nights wondering whether I was being unfair, whether I had misunderstood, whether Karen had simply been desperate. Now I knew better. The investigation continued after that meeting. I won't pretend it happened overnight. It didn't. There were interviews, more bank records, questions about the paperwork, questions about the attempted transfer, questions about Frank's financial problems, and questions about the strange events surrounding that Sunday dinner. The glass itself became part of the investigation. I never learned exactly what Karen intended to put in it. And strangely enough, I'm glad I didn't. Some things don't need a name to teach you a lesson. What mattered was that Daniel had seen enough to know something wasn't right, and he had acted. Karen and Frank eventually faced serious legal consequences related to the financial scheme. I won't give you a courtroom speech because real life wasn't like that. There wasn't one dramatic moment when everybody applauded. There were hearings, documents, lawyers, a lot of waiting. Karen tried more than once to convince people that she had only been trying to protect me. She said she was worried about my ability to manage everything. She said she thought I needed help. But the records told a different story. And records don't get nervous when someone asks questions. They don't change their story. They just sit there. One afternoon after another meeting with Susan Daniel, and I stopped at a little diner near my house. We ordered coffee and sandwiches. For the first time in months, we talked about something that had nothing to do with money. Daniel complained about traffic on I-465. I complained about the price of eggs. He laughed. "You still buy the expensive ones. They taste better. They're eggs. Then you buy the cheap ones." He smiled. I missed this. So did I. After we finished eating, Daniel became quiet. "Mom, I don't know what I'm supposed to do now." I knew what he meant. His marriage was over. His trust was broken. He had spent months questioning his own judgment, and there was no easy way to repair any of that. You don't have to figure it all out this week. He looked at me. What if I should have seen it sooner? I took a sip of coffee. You probably should have. He looked down. But that doesn't mean you're responsible for what someone else chose to do. He nodded slowly. I thought I could fix everything. I know. I couldn't. No. I reached across the table and touched his hand. But you did one important thing. What you listened when something didn't feel right. He looked at me. Eventually counts. He smiled. That was enough. A few months later, things became quieter. I changed my banking arrangements. I updated my estate documents with Susan. I made sure my mother had the proper people listed for her care. I also made one rule for myself. If anyone ever handed me a document and said, "Just sign here," I would read every word first. And if I didn't understand it, I would ask someone independent. No exceptions. Daniel moved into a small apartment not far from my house. On Sunday mornings, he usually came over for breakfast. Sometimes we'd have pancakes, sometimes eggs and toast. Sometimes we'd just drink coffee and talk. It wasn't the same as before, but slowly it became something new. One Saturday, Tom stopped by after a neighborhood cookout carrying a foil tray. I brought leftovers. I looked inside. There was enough barbecue to feed 6 people. "Tom, there are only 2 of us." He shrugged. "That's what happens when people don't know how to cook for 4 instead of 14. I laughed. He looked at me seriously. "Good." "What?" "You're laughing again." I rolled my eyes. "Don't get sentimental on me. Wouldn't dream of it." That evening I sat alone on my back porch. The sun was going down. The neighborhood was quiet. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A lawnmower ran in the distance. For months I had thought about that Sunday dinner. I used to think the most frightening part was the possibility that someone had wanted to hurt me. But eventually I realized something else. The hardest part was accepting that I had ignored small warning signs because I didn't want to believe them. I had trusted family. There was nothing wrong with that. But trust doesn't mean handing someone the keys to your life and refusing to look at where they're driving. Sometimes protecting yourself means asking uncomfortable questions. Sometimes it means saying no. And sometimes it means listening when the person sitting across the table quietly tells you not to drink the water. Daniel still has the phone he used that night. I don't know why he kept it. Maybe neither of us wants to forget what happened. Not because we want to live in the past, but because there are moments when one small decision changes everything. That night, my son could have stayed quiet. He could have convinced himself that he was imagining things. He could have protected his marriage at my expense. Instead, he slid that phone under the table. And I trusted him. That's what saved me. Not revenge, not money, not even the paperwork. It was the fact that when it mattered, my son chose to believe his own instincts. And eventually, I learned to believe mine too. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting yourself, I hope you remember that protecting yourself isn't selfish. And if this story stayed with you, thank you for spending part of your day with me. I'll see you in the next story.